Hey guys, congratulations on finishing, finishing, finishing the first half of AP US history. When you get to Reconstruction in 1877, once the North pulls the troops out of the South, that is basically the official end of the first half of US history. And now we can start looking at the second half of US history. Our first major stop is going to be World War One, but the thing is, that's still 40 years away. So there's going to be a lot of drastic changes in this country over the next 40 years to get us to a point when we can be ready to even fight in World War One. The United States in 1877 is drastically different than the United States in 1917 when we enter World War One. So our discussion over the next four and a half, five chapters is to get us ready to fight in a major world war. So let's go ahead and start that story. Chapter 17 is going to be about Native Americans living out west. Um, Essentially, this is going to be really the end of the official Native American story in this country. Chapter 17 is a pretty short chapter, and it's really just going to mention Native Americans out west and what happens with them. And really, even though this is only chapter 17, we're essentially going to be done with the Native American story once this chapter is over, which is sad and unfortunate, but that's kind of the way things go. Let's start with what you probably think a Native American looks like. So this is a depiction of a Native American tribe. And again, this is usually the visual image that we have of Native Americans, mainly because of movies and TV shows. And I know for a fact that when I was a kid watching Walt Disney cartoons, this is how Native Americans were depicted. However, this is a very specific tribe, and this is not how most tribes were actually going to be in the United States. Or in the North American continent, I guess we should appropriately say. So again, this is not quite what Native Americans look like. Let's go ahead and discuss the current issues with the tribes that we are facing. So, as Americans are moving west, we start to run into some tribes that we really haven't seen much of before. The first big tribe that we find are the Sioux. The Sioux Native Americans are a what's the word I'm looking for here? They are a nomadic tribe that moves around large swaths of territory. So they're also one of the more violent of the Native American tribes. And again, I don't mean that to be, culturally insensitive, but that's just kind of what this tribe is like. They are a more warlike tribe that is big game hunters that are looking after certain game. So, uh, when we are moving westward, we pretty much tell the Sioux to get out of our way, and they say no. And then on top of that, once they finally do start moving westward to get away from us, they're going to start running into other Native American tribes, and they're not going to get along so well. So the Sioux tribe is going to run into the Pawnee tribe, and they're basically going to have some fights with each other over who should have access to this land. Um, we have kind of set aside land for these certain tribes, that way they wouldn't have to fight each other. But if you're a nomadic tribe like the Sioux, being fit in one small space is not good for how you live. So a couple of fights break out between these two groups, and eventually the United States decides, okay, apparently Native American tribes are a little different, and they don't all get along, and we can't just all shove them in one place and hope for the best. So the U.S. government's going to establish the reservation system, which is going to basically set aside chunks of land for each individual tribe. That way they don't have to work together if they don't want to. And the Sioux Indians don't want to work with anyone. Well, what are the Sioux doing? Why are the Sioux such a nomadic tribe? What are they looking for? They're hunting buffalo. Now, if you've never seen a buffalo, they're like a really, really big cow. Kind of a big, scary looking cow with a much bigger head, and they are much more powerful. They are much faster. They are quite the animal. If you ever come up close to one, they're kind of terrifying. Um, Before the United States started expanding westward, there were over 30 million of these animals before westward expansion. Now, well, they're not quite an endangered species, but they're pretty close. What happened? Well, the white man's basically going to wipe out this animal. This animal is pivotal to Native American culture and Native American existence. Native Americans are going to use this animal for food. They are going to use every part of this animal for clothing, for tools, for housing. This animal is used for everything for Native American cultures. And unfortunately, when the white man moves westward, we pretty much just hunt and shoot these animals and just let them die. We're not going to use them with the same reverence that the Native Americans do. Army generals are also going to encourage U.S. settlers to intentionally kill as many buffalo as possible, knowing that it would weaken the Native American tribes that depended on these buffalo for their existence. Out on a road trip a couple years ago, and came across one of these buffalo in my car. Buffalo are they don't have a lot of natural predators in the wild, so they're very relaxed and calm, and they're not super scared or freaked out of humans, which is possibly part of the reason why they were so easy for the Americans who are moving westward to, to kill. They also travel in herds. They travel in packs like this. And again, these guys are right by the side of the road. There are cars zipping by, and these guys are completely unconcerned with human life. Now, that being said, uh, I wouldn't want to have one running and charging at me because they are still kind of big and terrifying when they want to be, but they're not really all that concerned about humans. So when humans decide that they want to start killing these animals, and if you are an American, you kill these animals for sport as you're moving westward, it's not like it's really hard because they kind of just stand there. Again, it's kind of weird. It's a weird description. They're big and scary, but they kind of just stand there. Okay, let's move on with Native Americans. Sorry, I got sidetracked by big animals. Um, the Native Americans, as we start moving westward into the Dakota region and into the Montana region, we start to run into Native American tribes like the Sioux that are a little bit more violent, and we have to deal with them a little bit differently than we dealt with natives like the Cherokee or the Seminole Indians. Um, the Sioux Indians want nothing to do with us, and they are willing to fight us over their land, whereas other Native American tribes really weren't so ready to do that. These Native American tribes out in the Dakota region are going to actively fight and resist being put on reservations. They're going to actively fight and resist American settlers pretty much the entire way, all the way really up through the 1890s. In order to prevent any future fighting with these Native American tribes, Congress is going to sign something called the Fort Laramie Treaty with the Sioux Indians. It's basically going to grant them this huge, large region of land, basically from South Dakota all the way up through and to Montana. That's a very, very big swath of land. And these Sioux Indians are going to say, okay, fine, we'll have this plot of land, but everyone else needs to stay out. In fact, Sioux Indians, led by a guy named Sitting Bull, began actively hunting and killing any white settler that came into the region. Well, obviously, Congress is not going to be okay with Americans being, killed. So they decide in 1874 to send out a dude named General George Custer to the region. His job was to basically make sure that the Sioux Indians stopped killing white settlers by any means necessary. General George Custer is going to take 600 men into South Dakota, and basically start just killing any Native American that he finds. Custer is going to march his men into the Native American territory, and the Native Americans are going to fight back. There is a famous battle called Custer's Last Stand. I bet you can guess what happened to Custer. He didn't quite make it out of that. Uh, so obviously, the defeat at Little Bighorn is going to convince the United States that, you know what, sending 600 soldiers to deal with a violent Native American tribe is not going to be enough, and we're going to have to do something else to ensure that Native Americans are no longer killing white settlers. As Congress debates this issue, someone else comes forward and says some other things about Native Americans. Custer's Last Stand convinced Americans that the problems out west needed to be actively handled. Uh, Most people's first response is, well, okay, let's go ahead and send the military and just kill all of them. But this woman named Helen Hunt Jackson is going to disagree. Helen Hunt Jackson writes a book called A Century of Dishonor, which detailed how the government has treated the Native Americans for the last 100, or really 300 years. Basically, this book is going to go into detail saying how Native Americans are basically going to have their land, their lives, and their culture taken away from them, all because the whites decide they want this land that in a lot of cases the whites aren't really going to use either. This book is basically going to detail just how terribly white Americans have treated Native Americans and how unfortunate it is that this had to happen. Um, what is going on? Well, basically, we kind of realize that maybe the Native Americans just don't understand our culture. And what we need to do is actually to assimilate the Native Americans to be more like us. And if the Native Americans could just become more like white Americans, they wouldn't have any problems with us anymore, and we could all understand each other and live in harmony. Here is we come up with this thing called the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. This act is going to be designed to assimilate or to acculturate the natives. It's a fancy way of saying we're going to take natives off of their plantations, namely their kids, by the way. We're going to take kids off of plantations. We're going to cut their hair. We're going to make them change their language. We're going to make them change their religion. We're going to make them change their clothes and basically disassociate with everything that made them a Native American and teach them how to act more white like regular Americans. Essentially, this is going to uh, distance Native American children from their own families. The most perverse part of this is after a couple of years of indoctrination, the um, Americans are going to allow the Native American children to go back to see their families, and now their families like don't really want to talk to them anymore, don't associate with them. So now this next generation of natives is basically lost all cultural ties, and within a couple of years, this pretty much wipes out all Native American culture in this country by just forcing Native American kids to become like regular Americans. This is so heinous and this is so bad that as a country today, we really try to go out of our way to appreciate and to understand the Native American struggle. And if you go to historical sites or national parks, there's this big influx of information about Native American tribes in this region because the United States was so successful at wiping out Native American identity. We don't know very much about these cultures anymore because they were so wiped out. They're a big part of this country's history, but they're going to be wiped out so thoroughly that now we're doing anything we can to preserve whatever information we can about these Native American tribes. Because it's unfortunate that we basically lost all access to this information because we are going to force the Native Americans to give up their own culture. After years of fighting with these tribes in the Dakota region, and after years of conflicts and problems with Native Americans, we're pretty much going to have one last big blowout battle between the American settlers and the Native American tribes. The battle is going to be called the Battle of Wounded Knee, which is in a place called South Dakota. A U.S. regiment is going to be standing guard near a Sioux reservation. Someone fired a gun, and the U.S. responded by launching cannon fires. In 7 minutes, 300 Native Americans died, and essentially, this is going to be the end of Native American resistance in this country. The Native Americans are not like they're bad fighters or anything, but they're nowhere near on the level of the American settlers that are moving west with their big guns and their big cannons. And the Native Americans essentially stop having big major fights and insurrections against us. It took until 1890, but essentially the United States has won the 125-year-long war with the Native Americans. And now white settlers are basically free to go as west as they want and not worry about any further Native American insurrections or incursions against them. This is the end of the Native American story. Not that I won't talk about some Native American groups later on in the year, but this is essentially where their story ends. So, now that the Native American tribes have basically been dealt with and they're no longer a major concern for settlers moving west, now we can start actually really filling out the American West. The best way for us to do this is to build a transcontinental railroad, a railroad that would go from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, because it would certainly be a heck of a lot easier than walking. So, in 1862, the Union, in the height of the Civil War, is going to pass the Pacific Railroad Act. They're basically going to pass a law that says, let's build a railroad that connects this country during the height of the American Civil War. At first, that might not make a lot of sense, but you have to realize that the logic here is that if we build a railroad and start moving people westward, and the North is building and funding this railroad, then Northern ideals will be moving west, even during the height of the Civil War. So the Union makes it a very big goal of theirs to build a transcontinental railroad. The idea is to go from California all the way to Nebraska, which is where the railroad lines currently end, and this would connect the gold fields of California with the business and development of the East Coast. There's going to be two railroad companies that do it. One is called the Union Pacific Railroad, whose goal is to make it to California, and then the Central Pacific Railroad, whose goal is to make it from California to the east. These two railroad lines are supposed to meet in the middle, which, by the way, they do in Utah. It is the railroads that transform the West more than any other single factor. The Army is going to use it to quickly move troops and supplies to be able to beat the Native Americans. It's going to be used to ship settlers and their supplies westward. It's also going to be used to take crops that are grown out west and then send them back east. That way the East Coast can become less reliant on farming and more reliant on business. It's also going to standardize what a railroad should look like in a railroad width in gauges. So basically, a gauge is how wide apart the railroad is. So before the U.S. built the Transcontinental Railroad, every company would make their railroad a slightly different size, which is super inconvenient and it doesn't make a lot of sense. So when the government steps in and builds a Transcontinental Railroad, every single railroad is going to be the exact same width, and it's going to do a really good job of making it easier for all railroad lines to be the same in this country. The railroad companies soon become the largest landholders in the West. As the railroad moved into a new region, the territory or state would grant them land in the form of payment. By 1893, the railroad landholdings were worth over $500 million in this country. We also need people to actually, live out here. If we're going to build a railroad to go out west, we have to actually develop this land. Coinciding with the passage of the Pacific Railroad Act, we're also going to see the Homestead Act of 1862, which is designed to give people more land to move westward. The U.S. government would give 160 acres of land. That's basically larger than the size of Disneyland and California Adventure put together. The U.S. would give you 160 acres of land for $10. All you had to do was go live out here. The problem is, all of the good land is taken over very quickly, and all that's left is a bunch of crappy land out west that nobody really wants. Only 12% of the land intended for poor farmers is actually going to be given to them, and of that 12%, fewer than 3% actually go and develop this land out west. The second problem is that not all land is created equal. 160 acres of land in Southern California is much more valuable than 160 acres of land in the middle of Utah. So, not all land is going to be created equal. Life on the plains, by the way, is not very easy. Everything you need has to be brought with you because there really is no city or development or government there to help you get set up. The farming tools and techniques that worked on the East Coast or the American South do not work. In fact, the Great Plains are also a completely different climate zone. So it's going to require completely different types of farming. The same crops that would grow in the American East Coast do not work in the Great Plains. It's a completely different amount of rain. New equipment had to be created in order to bust the land. While this worked for some, the new equipment is extremely expensive, so it's very difficult to have a small farm where you can earn money on the Great Plains. The weather patterns on the Great Plains are also significantly different than those of the rest of the United States. The Great Plains is susceptible to droughts, floods, tornadoes, grasshopper infestations, frogs raining from the sharknadoes. See what happens when I try to be funny? I get so excited to tell a joke that I forget what I'm saying. Anyway, the Great Plains are a very difficult place to live. Over the half the people who purchase the land are soon going to abandon it, and those that end up staying here out west, we're going to call sodbusters. Sodbusters is a fancy phrase of saying these are people that are going to stay and try to make a living here and to break up this land, despite how difficult it actually is to do. All of that being said, this westward expansion does work. By the year 1912, the United States has basically filled out its map, and there are 48 states added to the Union. Alaska and Hawaii are going to be added much later, but every state that we know and love in the contiguous United States is a member of the U.S. by 1912. So this westward expansion, the expansion of the railroad, um, the ideal to push west has all become very effective. The Americans are moving west. By the way, this region, even though it's still kind of sparsely populated in comparison to the very densely populated American East Coast, this region is going to become very important in future elections because it's a huge swath of people over a big swath of territory. Um, while no one state is really super important, the West kind of votes the same way. So even though, for example, three people live in Wyoming, those three people are going to agree with things that the rest of the states that surround them would also agree with. So the American West can't be ignored in future political campaigns. This is a problem we're going to see develop later in the textbook. Here's the good news. The next three slides you're probably not going to hear a lot about on the AP exam, but I'll mention it anyway because why not? You should learn U.S. history, that's why you are taking this class. So the American Southwest is going to be this weird exception when it comes to the rest of the country. It was the one of the few regions that was actually actively occupied by another country, i.e. Mexico and Spain. And there's going to be a lot of like pre-established land treaties and land ownership out here out west, especially here in California. In California, there are going to be a bunch of people that previously owned land. They're called the Californios, which I'm assuming is a Spanish term for residents that are occupying this land. When the United States won the Mexican-American War, we didn't just kick out all the people that own land here in the American Southwest. We let them stay. But as we realize, as we start moving westward, these people that have been here for generations have already taken the best land. We can't have that. We can't have a bunch of non-American citizens living in American land taking over the best land, can we? No, of course not. So, we're going to start passing a bunch of laws that are going to restrict the freedom and movement of Latino Americans, essentially. So, the racism that we exhibit towards Black Americans and Native Americans is going to be extended, especially out here in California, towards Mexican Americans. So much so that Mexican Americans just decide in mass to basically just leave California in the American Southwest because all their stuff's being taken away from them anyway. They see no purpose in staying. Unfortunately, while the story of the American West is the story of mining and the story of gold and the story of silver, unfortunately, it's also the story of environmental degradation. While it's all neat to imagine panning for gold in a river, unfortunately, this is going to cause a lot of mass erosion, a lot of mass pollution, and a lot of destruction of the beauty of the American Southwest. I'll take that back. Not just American Southwest, the American West in general is going to be start being destroyed in certain regions. This is going to lead us to something a little bit later where we realize that we should preserve these regions and establish national parks to make sure that these beautiful regions aren't destroyed. But unfortunately, before we can do that, we actually cause a lot of environmental degradation and damage to some of the most beautiful places of this country. And of course, no discussion of the American Southwest would be complete without the discussion of cowboys. You know, whenever you talk to someone from outside of the United States, they just assume that we are all cowboys, that we all look like this. This is how we spend our weekends. And as we know, that is only partially true. The romanticization is a big, fancy, scary word for saying, like, the idea that being a cowboy is the greatest type of American is going to start sprouting around in the 1860s and 1870s as another means to get people to move out west. Most cowboys were non-white. Most were former slaves, or they were Mexican males who would spend their 20s and 30s basically working 14 hours a day and doing cowboy stuff. The exact same thing that you see on TV or in movies about cowboys, or how many of these uh, youth are going to spend most of their time. They work uh, 14-hour days, 7 days a week. They earn about $30 a month, which is not a lot of money even back then. And because they basically work themselves so hard, life expectancy out west as a cattle rancher is about 38 years old, whereas out east, life expectancy is closer to 50. So that's a big difference. Anyway, these people are going to be like this romanticized version of how great it is to live out west. And then in like the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, we make a whole bunch of movies about these groups of people that live in this lawless land where they really decide what America really is. Um, that being said, they're basically just farmers that are living a very rough, meager existence out west. So maybe we shouldn't romanticize them because they didn't really have that good of a life. In 1893, the U.S. government is going to declare the frontier closed. This, the frontier, of course, is this lawless, open expanse of U.S. land that doesn't have any government interference. In 1893, the U.S. government declares this closed, and a bunch of historians started freaking out. A bunch of people said, wait a minute, what truly makes America is this lawless, open West where you basically have to make your own laws, you have to make your own government, you have to survive on your own. That's what a true American is. And if you think about it, go all the way back to the very first Americans, the Puritans, and think about what they had to do. They had to establish their own government, they had to take care of themselves. There wasn't anyone here to bail them out. And from that moment all the way up until 1893, we've always had this open expanse of empty land without government interference where we had to take care of ourselves. In 1893, the US government declares that there isn't any place that we don't know of anymore. There isn't any place outside of government interference. A Wisconsin historian named Frederick Jackson Turner is going to write a paper titled The Significance of the Frontier in American History, in which he states that a true American is developed out here in the West, out in the wild, away from the influence of the US government. Let's read this quote together. He says that American social developments have been continually beginning over and over again on the frontier. This perennial rebirth, this fluidity of American life, this expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch from the simplicity of primitive society, furnish the forces dominating the American character. What does this mean? He's basically saying that the frontier is going to encourage individualism and democratic ideals with little control of the government. He feared that if this frontier is gone, there's going to be no place for Americans to learn on their own what they needed to learn to survive and to exist as Americans. He also feared that without a West, without a frontier, there wouldn't be a place to create true American men. His arguments and this idea of what makes an American and how we study history opens up a new field in history called historiography. Historiography is basically the way that historians develop history. How do we decide what story to tell? How do we decide what makes a culture? Frederick Jackson Turner is going to argue that the American West and this Western frontier is what makes an American. That is the first real example that we have of historiography in this country. He does not include women or different non-white races in his thesis. His concern is only with white men. He argues that women and other races don't have historical agency. Historical agency means what impact or effect does a person have on the history of the United States or the history of the world? Turney is going to argue that women and non-whites have no direct effect on history. So he makes a really good point about the American West maybe having us lose our identity as a country, and then he makes a really terrible point by saying that non-whites don't matter and women don't matter. Oh, Frederick Jackson Turner. By the way, the reason why we discuss this historian and not any other historians really is that this is a historian that shows up on the on the AP exam, because if you understand his argument and you understand this idea of what he thinks the American West should be, you understand basically everything in Chapter 17. So if you're going to be asked about anything in Chapter 17 on an AP exam, you're going to be asked about Frederick Jackson Turner and the importance of the American West. And now you know what it is. We are done with Chapter 17. Let's move on to the more fun chapters. Okay, on to chapter 18, and thank God because I really hate chapter 17. So let's move on to chapter 18. Chapter 18 is going to talk about a lot of different things, a lot of different nouns that you're going to have to know. But it's actually much more linear and much easier to understand. Chapter 18 is going to be talking about big business, how America goes, again, from being an agrarian country to being completely controlled by business, and how a few small businesses are going to grow into being the only businesses in this country, and how a couple of men who start with nothing are going to become the richest Americans to ever live. That's all possible in chapter 18, and that's what we're going to be discussing. So let's talk about the six major components behind the rise of business in America. Okay, number one, we have a lot of natural resources that we can exploit. Number two, we have the rapid spread of technological innovation. Whenever a new technology becomes available, we can spread it all throughout the country. And we can steal ideas from Europe. Number three, we have a need for new workers to work in a bunch of factories. Those new workers are going to buy products that are going to be made in different factories, and this is going to help spur the economy. Number four, there's going to be a lot of competition among firms. The government is going to allow businesses to compete with each other, which leads to number five. Because businesses are competing, they're going to try to drop their prices as much as possible. Competition is a good thing in this country. It forces businesses to make the biggest and best product for the cheapest price. And because the prices of goods are going to go down, it's going to encourage more Americans to buy more things and help business grow. It's a cycle. Finally, number six, we are capable of making more products than we actually need. So we can make more products in this country than we have a need than we can buy, which means we need to actually keep growing our businesses and try to sell our stuff in different places all over the world. If you can understand these six components, you can understand why everything that happens in US history from this point forward happens. Um, let's talk about the impact of all this growth. So, while cheap manufacturing helped economic growth, it was not the only significant factor. One change in American business is going to be the discovery of the safe use of electricity. Soon, inventions such as the sewing machine, the telephone, the light bulb, and other and other items are going to change everyday life. Something as simple as a sewing machine had a drastic effect on the social aspect of the country. Women were no longer required to make a simple clothing, and soon more fashionable clothing hit the marketplace. We'll get back into that in a minute. The biggest and greatest inventor in American history is going to be this dude named Thomas Edison. Him and all of his employees are going to make inventions that epitomize the era. He was directly involved with the invention of the light bulb, the phonograph, the microphone, the motion capture camera, picture and film, and the storage battery. At his peak, he had a new invention every 10 days. He had over 1,000 inventions by the time he died in 1931. And he caused invention to become a part of big business. And every time he invented something, people are going to be desperate to have it in their homes. And businesses are going to be desperate to create it and to be able to market it and sell it to the American public. Thomas Edison is basically going to become one of the best representatives we have of this era. Now, going back to my previous point, with increased production of goods, soon other items become fashionable. Suddenly, because we can make stuff that isn't necessarily absolutely necessary for our survival, now we can make goods and items that aren't necessary for our survival. People are going to start wanting them. We're going to start needing unnecessary items such as jewelry, furniture, and other unnecessary stuff. They're easier to produce, so Americans are going to want them. Advertising and marketing also become very important during this time period. Not only did a company need to make a product, they needed to convince you to buy it. Soon, packaged goods with specific brand names could be bought nationwide. People began to search out brand names and expect the same quality everywhere. By 1900, the United States has the most productive economy in the world, and the United States has become a major world power because of it. Nearly every aspect of American life is going to be industrialized, which is a fancy way of saying we buy pretty much every good we ever need. However, the costs were felt the strongest in the workers. Immigrant laborers are going to spend 12 to 14 hours a day working for very low wages to produce all of these goods for us. This is also going to force women and children to enter the labor market just so a family could survive. Even though we have all these goods and even though everyone's working and we're making all this stuff, nearly 80% of American families were living at or near the poverty level. When you have to buy everything that you need to survive, you have to have a lot of money. If you don't earn a lot of money, you're going to be working a lot to just barely get by. Okay, so now that we know that Americans are buying literally everything we possibly can, now that we know that, let's start looking at how some of these businesses get so big. Okay, so again, with a general understanding that Americans are working in factories and that Americans are trying to buy every product they can, let's talk about some of the biggest businesses. My goodness. Okay, so let's start with the railroad. When in doubt, everything in this country in the 1800s is going to revolve around the railroad. It's going to become the biggest business in this country, and if you are involved with making something the railroad needs, whether it be cutting down trees or making steel or making railroad cars or the oil that it uses, anything involving the railroad is going to be a big, big business. Railroads are the major industry of the time period, and almost all industrial growth comes because of the railroad. The problem is, railroads are really, really expensive to build and operate. So businessmen, otherwise known as capitalists, would raise stock in a company, artificially inflate the value of this stock. They would sell the stock to the average Americans to raise money, and they would keep the profits. The biggest example we have of a company doing this is going to be this dude named Jay Gould. He is a robber baron. So again, to think of how this works, a robber baron says, okay, I'm going to build a railroad. All right, sweet. But to build it, I need some investors. So if you guys all give me $100, we'll build this railroad. And then when the railroad's built and we're going to charge people money to use it, I'll pay you guys back with interest. And we're like, oh yeah, okay, that's a great way to make money. Everyone's making money off the railroad. So everyone in the class gives him $100, and then that railroad never gets built. He keeps all that money and disappears. That is a robber baron, and Jay Gould is the best example that we have. During the 1870s, after the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, industry leaders are going to get together to begin to consolidate hundreds of separate railroad companies into a few larger companies. By 1906, there are only 7 major railroad companies left in the country. They're going to standardize all equipment to make the process easier to build and to use. They're also going to set up time zones in the United States to run the railroads more efficiently. This is done completely independently of the US government. It's going to change what the United States looks like and how we operate every single day, and the US government has nothing to do with it. The downside, though, is that this business, as it grows, is going to become like evil. We'll talk about how that all works, but let's move on to the next aspect of this chapter. Okay, so let's talk about one of the big businesses. Let's talk about the steel industry. So, one of the major industries to expand because of the railroads is going to be the steel industry. Obviously, railroads require a lot of steel. We're going to use steel to not only build the railroad cars, but it's actually going to be on the lines that the railroad actually runs on. So steel is going to be drastically important for the production of railroads. There's this dude in Europe named Henry Bessemer who's going to revolutionize the steel making process and discovers how to make steel faster and how to make it stronger. Again, that's just a fact about the world. Don't think it's going to show up on an AP exam. Anyway, the person who will show up on the AP exam is going to be this dude named Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie is a Scottish immigrant who recognized the potential in the steel industry. He began working in the railroad industry, slowly making his way to becoming a manager and a partial owner of a railroad. In 1870, he realizes that, well, while the railroad's fun and all, you can make a lot more money if you are producing the steel that the railroad needs. In 1870, he decides to start a steel factory called the Carnegie Steel Company. By using cost-cutting measures, he eventually produces half of the world's steel and becomes one of the richest men in America for a pretty long time. How does he do it? Well, he does this thing called vertical integration to guarantee success. Here's how vertical integration works. He's going to control all aspects of the production of steel, from the mining of the ore that you use to make the steel with, to the creation of the product, to the distribution of the product to the customer. Every single step of the process of making steel is all controlled by Andrew Carnegie. He doesn't buy certain components from other people. Every single aspect of the production of steel is going to be done by Andrew Carnegie's company. That is vertical integration. The best way to think about how this works would be McDonald's buying a cow farm. So McDonald's makes hamburgers. Rather than buy the meat from someone else, if they grow all of their own meat, you grow meat? No, you raise cattle that become meat. So if McDonald's were to have a cow farm that was owned by the McDonald's Corporation that gave it all of its hamburgers, that is a process. That is an example of vertical integration. That's what Andrew Carnegie is going to do. Carnegie is going to use vertical integration to become one of the richest Americans using steel. But the richest American to ever live, and in fact, some historians argue the richest human being to ever live, is going to be a guy named John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller is going to be involved with oil. Here's his story. Oil at this time period is going to be used for light, especially at night. It's also going to be used for heating, and eventually, by the end of this story, we're going to use oil for other things like for powering of cars and for the powering of trains. But for right now, it's just used for light. John D. Rockefeller was a lot like Andrew Carnegie. He comes into the industry early and learns how it works, and both are going to be concerned with cost-cutting measures and efficiency to control the market. In 1873, Rockefeller starts a company called the Standard Oil Company, and he's going to use a different practice called horizontal integration. So while Carnegie does vertical integration to control every aspect of making his product, Rockefeller has a better idea. Instead of controlling every aspect of making your product, he wants to be the only person you can buy oil from. It's called horizontal integration. The basic idea here is he's going to buy out every single one of his competitors. So if you want to get oil, you have to buy it from him. It would be like if McDonald's were to buy out Burger King, Carl's Jr., Wendy's, The Habit, In-N-Out. It's like the only place you can get a burger now is McDonald's, or any place you go to is selling McDonald's hamburgers and nothing else. That's essentially what Rockefeller does with the Standard Oil Company. So his goal is to not only buy out suppliers of oil, but to buy out any other oil driller company he could find. He wanted to be the only person on earth you could buy oil from. If a company refused to join Standard Oil or anything else, Rockefeller would use his vast fortune to his advantage. Here's what he would do. Let's pretend that there is an oil shop across the street from one of Rockefeller's. Rockefeller will intentionally lower the price of oil, and he'll make that oil so cheap that his competitor can't match that price. Once his competitor goes out of business, and they leave the market, Rockefeller will now increase the price of oil back to higher than it was before to make up the cost. By 1879, Rockefeller is going to control 90% of all of the United States oil. He becomes the richest man of all time in America. He alone is going to account for nearly 2% of the entire U.S. economic output. Roughly $1 trillion in 2015 money. That's how much this guy is worth. The richest American and perhaps the richest human being to ever live. He's also going to develop the Standard Oil Trust. So at the time period, a lot of people are going to be really upset that people like Carnegie and people like Rockefeller control the entire aspect and the entire aspect of production of their product. So people are going to be really upset by that. So to make people seem like there's actually competition when there's not, Rockefeller is going to start something called the Standard Oil Trust. A trust is when you merge with other companies within your industry to all work together to get more profits. Here's how it works. So let's just pretend that there are two oil companies. they're going to agree to work together and basically split up the money between the two of them. They're not really going to compete. They're going to sell the oil for at or almost the exact same price. The idea being that you could buy from company A or company B, but the money is all going to end up in the same bucket at the end of the month. That's essentially how a trust works. So I'll give you the more lengthy definition that uses all these extra words. The shareholders of each individual company are going to pool their money together and use a group of trustees to manage the shared profits. The trustees are not really part of any specific company. They form from their own company to manage the money given to them. The trustees are going to gain dividends, or which is a fancy way of saying profits, and all of the mutually managed money and divide it equally among all of the members of the trust. Essentially what's going to happen here, and I'll make this even easier than what I just said. Companies are all going to pool their money together. They're not really going to compete with each other. They're going to pull their money together. And by doing this, they're going to become bigger and bigger and bigger and more powerful. Rockefeller is going to own the largest economic trust in the world, and he's going to be one of the richest men because of this. It eventually gets to a point where Rockefeller has a monopoly over all oil in the country. Another word for this is an oligopoly, which basically means that there are a few people that control all of the economic output of a company. Rockefeller is going to be ruthless when it comes to business. His logic is he's going to use this idea called social Darwinism. As you guys know, Darwin has a theory that says survival of the fittest, and the best and brightest animals, I suppose, are the ones that survive. So Rockefeller is going to use that same principle when it comes to business. So yes, he's going to do some big, crazy, horrible, mean things to other businesses, but he has the right to, because that's just social Darwinism. He is the best businessman, so he should control the entire market. He should be the richest human being to ever live, because he is the best. And he doesn't really care what happens to his employees in the process. To counter the growth of these major businesses, the US government's going to get together and say, we should probably step in and stop these businesses from getting so huge. The government's going to pass something called the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. This act is going to outlaw trusts or other forms of monopolies because what was happening is that these monopolies were ending up hurting the American economy. It looked good that there be a couple of really rich businessmen, but in the process, they're going to destroy hundreds of other smaller businesses. So while Rockefeller is really stupid rich, he's basically made it so that way no one else can make money besides him. That's not good for the American economy. So the Sherman Antitrust Act is going to make monopolies or trusts illegal. The problem is this act is actually really weak and doesn't define what a trust is. And as we know from the Ninth Amendment, if it's not against the law, then it is okay. So because the Sherman Antitrust Act doesn't actually define what a trust is, it's basically impossible for the government to enforce this. Just to be safe and to protect all of his money, Rockefeller is going to change the name of his trust from the Standard Oil Trust to the Standard Oil Holding Company. It's the exact same thing but with a different name, and because it has a different name, the government basically can't enforce it or say it's illegal. So once again, the Antitrust Act is actually really going to be ineffective at this time period, and big business is basically going to control everything. That being said, it's not like Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller were actually the worst human beings to ever live. Now, granted, they wanted to control everything they possibly could, but it wasn't like they were necessarily the worst humans to ever live. They weren't necessarily entirely evil. In fact, they're going to go out of their way and start doing this thing called philanthropy, which is a word I do not pronounce well. The basic idea is, yes, we are the richest human beings to ever live, but it is also the job or the duty of the wealthy to provide and take care of the people around them. So the wealthy should use their God-given wealth to do public works projects and to build things that maybe the people on their own can't. So if you go to New York, there's actually a bunch of buildings and a bunch of libraries and a bunch of museums that you can visit for free that were built by Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. They're going to use their money and use it for the public good. We're going to read a document in class called The Gospel of Great Wealth by a dude named Andrew Carnegie. Basically, what it says is that it's the job of the rich to buy things and to make things for the public good. The rich have a duty to spend their money because if they spend their money, people will have jobs making things for the rich. We call this trickle-down economics, and we'll talk about this idea more in the 1980s with President Reagan. But the basic premise is if the rich spend their money, then there's gonna be jobs for people like us who aren't rich to make things for rich people. The only problem with this plan is what happens if the rich don't buy anything? But we'll talk about that later. So now that we know that a few big businesses basically control everything in this country, let's talk about how the actual people are working for these big businesses. Unfortunately, one of the realities of a couple big businesses controlling everything is that they're not really going to care about their workforce. The way that people work is going to change dramatically during the 1800s. The way it used to work was that a artisan would, for example, let's talk about making a shoe. The way it used to work was that a artisan would spend a week making a shoe. He is a skilled laborer. He knows how to take nothing and turn it into a shoe. He might only be able to make one a week, but that shoe's going to be beautiful and it's going to be made by hand. Now, because of machinery, we're going to be able to make 4,800 shoes in a day. And you don't need to be some skilled craftsman that spends, a dozen years learning how to make something. Instead, basically, I could take any random person off the street, put them in front of a machine and say, okay, touch this button every second, and it's going to help make the shoe for you. So basically, we're going to have a lot of unskilled labor in this country. Unskilled labor requires no special training, no special techniques. Really, anyone could do it with enough training. That's unskilled labor. We're going to have a lot of unskilled labor in this country. Eventually, the unskilled work is going to be phased out, and a bunch of women and children are essentially going to be doing it. Something that used to take a week to make by hand can now be made within seconds. And on top of that, factories are going to be dangerous and in some cases openly hostile towards workers, particularly in steel mills where accident rates are going to be extremely high. And by the way, let's just pretend that you're at work and there's some machine that falls over and your legs fall off or whatever. Even if the company is at fault for the incident, they are not legally required to pay for the employee to get better. And because you're an unskilled laborer, you're easily replaced. So, okay, both your legs get chopped off in a factory explosion or something. Well, too bad, you can't work today, so I'm going to go ahead and bring in someone else. And I'm not going to pay you until you get better and can work. And by the way, now that I don't need you, you're so easily replaced, literally anyone can do that job. So, you might not have a job whenever you do get healthy. This is going to happen to a lot of workers during this time period. Going to work could actually kill you, and it's going to be extremely unsafe and extremely dangerous during this time period. Something needs to be done to make sure workers don't, die at work. Enter the creation of labor unions. I'll pause for a second on this next slide so you can copy all this down. Wait a minute, why am I going to pause? You guys can pause this video. Let me just explain it to you. So here's going to be the story of what starts to happen towards the end of this chapter. A business owner doesn't want to pay more money for unskilled labor. Workers can be easily replaced, and many workers will still work for low wages. So business owners don't want to pay a lot of money for unskilled labor. Workers always want more money and shorter working hours. To do this, they join together and form something called a labor union. Labor unions are going to be a collection of a bunch of workers that are going to argue and demand better rights for themselves. To get what they want, labor unions are going to go on strike or stop working until the factory loses money and shuts down, and then the owner is forced to agree to their demands. If you want to see how this whole process works, feel free to watch the Simpsons episode Last Exit to Springfield, season 4, episode 15, season 3, either way. Watch this episode. It kind of perfectly describes why a business owner is bad, why a labor union is created, and how labor unions get what they want. It's a really good way of actually understanding exactly what happens in U.S. history during this time period. So now that you guys know why labor unions exist, they exist to get better conditions for their workers. And now that we know that, your textbook's going to spend the remainder of the chapter giving you like 8 different examples of strikes and what they were for. Here's the good news. You already know. As long as you know this formula, you'll understand. I'm going to give you guys a bunch of different ones and I'll explain what each one of these is, but as long as you know the formula, you're going to be okay. Here we go. The government is really hands-off or laissez-faire during this entire period. There's going to be a lot of struggles between workers and businesses, and the government basically goes, well, this isn't really my problem. So when I'm telling you this entire story, you have to remember the US government is not on the side of the workers, and that's going to lead to a big change that we're going to talk about in a later chapter. Anyway, let's go through a couple of these stories. The first major labor union in this country was known as the National Labor Union in 1866, and it was founded to encourage better working conditions for the workers. The federal government is reluctant to help them, so this labor union is essentially on their own. They decide to lead a big strike in 1877 because they're upset with how things are being run in the railroad industry. The railroad industry is going to attempt to cut the wages of all workers by 10%. So the workers refuse to work and they basically stop the railroads nationwide. It's going to cripple all rail traffic. There's going to be a big giant fight during this railroad strike. Over 100 people are going to die, and the laborers don't really get what they want out of this strike. So it didn't really work. Let's talk about some more. So, in 1881, a second labor union is going to form called the Knights of Labor. This union was an all-inclusive union for all wage earners. This group's going to demand equal pay for women, an end to child labor, and better pay. This movement's going to grow to over 700,000 workers nationwide. And this union is going to lead to one of the most famous riots in the country. It's called the Haymarket Riot. This is going to be a nationwide strike of over 340,000 workers. They're going to be demanding a better life for themselves. Unfortunately, the American public doesn't actually side with this group, even though so many Americans are involved. The American public doesn't actually side with this group, and they're not going to be seen as being very popular. They're going to be seen as anarchists. So even though it would make sense for the U.S., the citizens of the United States to support labor unions, they really don't, because labor unions are going to be seen as like crazy and violent and un-American. I know it sounds strange, but it's true. The third major labor union in this country is actually going to be one of the first ones that's actually successful. This is called the American Federation of Labor, or AFL. This is going to be a skilled labor union, which means that the people in this union are actually going to be ones that can't be easily replaced by scabs. Scabs are people that are going to take the job of laborers when they're on strike. Anyway, it was led by a dude named Samuel Gompers, who believes that if corporations are going to organize and work together, so should the workers. He comes up with an idea called collective bargaining, which basically means that rather than a business making a contract with each individual employee, a business is going to make a contract with the entire group of employees. The best way to think about this is the way the teachers union works today. So I'm a teacher, and I agree if I'm going to work at Bonita High School, I'm going to agree that the union is going to negotiate my contract for me. All 100 teachers at Bonita High School are going to agree to the same contract, which means that the administration doesn't have to talk to me about my specific roles and duties or talk to any other teacher about our specific roles and duties, because we've agreed that we'll collectively bargain and we'll agree with whatever the union decides our job should be. That's what we'll decide on. It makes a business's life a lot easier. And because of this, and because of this idea, the American Federation of Labor is going to become one of the largest and most successful labor unions in the country. To get their way, this group goes on strike all the time. From 1881 to 1905, over 37,000 strikes take place, with over 7 million workers participating. But by doing this, these workers are starting to get the attention of people all over the country. Some companies are going to make employees sign yellow dog contracts. Yellow dog contracts are basically going to forbade workers from joining unions. So the day that you apply for a job and they say, okay, we're going to hire you, sign this piece of paper that says you're never going to join a union. Which sounds super illegal, but at the time period it wasn't. Why wasn't it illegal? Because the government is going to support big business. One major way that the government supports big business is going to be through strike breaking. So if workers go on strike, what will happen is the US government will send in troops to break or stop the strike. One of the major instances of this happening is the Homestead strike in 1892. The Homestead Steel Company stated that they were going to cut all wages by 20%. The company's going to lock out all workers and refuse to let them inside the building. As scabs try to break the picket lines and make it into the factory, they're going to be attacked by people that are going on strike. The company is going to bring in hundreds of police troops to basically surround the plant. And then meanwhile, the US government's going to bring in the military to stop the strike. Pretty crazy. But the US government is going to support the business, not the average American worker, no matter how bad or evil the business is. Okay, last one, and we are done with this chapter. Thank goodness. The Pullman Car Company is going to make luxury cars for trains. Pullman's going to build a planned community for his workers. So there's going to be a big giant factory, and then surrounding the factory is going to be a little town that all of his workers are going to live in. This is basically going to allow the business to have complete control over the workers' lives. When the Depression of 1893 hit, we'll talk about it later, Pullman announced that wages would be slashed by 20% without reducing the cost of rent in the village that he forces his workers to live in. Thousands of workers are going to join the American Railway Union under the leadership of a dude named Eugene V. Debs. Railroad workers across the country are going to strike because they're so upset with how the Pullman Palace Car Company is treating its employees. Long story short, Pullman's going to respond by linking his cars to trains carrying the U.S. mail. This way, if strikers refused to work, they would actually be stopping the U.S. government, not just the business. The president during this time period, named Grover Cleveland, says he's going to arrest the labor unions if they refuse to deliver the U.S. mail. The Supreme Court's going to rule in re Debs that the federal government's actions were constitutional, essentially telling companies that it is okay to break and destroy labor unions. Essentially, the U.S. government has decided that big business is more important than labor in this country. This is going to have drastic and crazy consequences in about 2 chapters. So, let's recap the story so far so you can understand how these 2 chapters have gone. Post-Civil War, the railroad industry is going to grow dramatically. This leads to the growth of other industries to build those railroads. Think of oil and steel. Big businesses form to make all of these products, and they're going to become monopolies or trust by making sure that no one else can compete with them. Factories are built to make more materials. These factories are going to hire unskilled laborers to make the materials faster and cheaper. Bad working conditions make laborers form unions to protect themselves. To get what they want, the unions go on strike. The government stops most strikes and does not support the workers and instead supports big business. That is the story of chapters 17 and 18. Now that we know that, I want you guys to go and take a break. We are an hour into this video. I want you guys to go and take a break and then come back and work on the next chapter. It's good for your brain to take a break when you're studying. It helps it actually retain stuff. Go get some exercise. Go walk your younger kid. Go walk the dog. Whatever you need to do, go take a break, and then we'll come back to chapter 19. Hey guys, as I am recording this, the Angels are winning their game. Mike Trout just hit a home run, so I'm happy. And my next door neighbor is listening to some very loud movie or rap album or something with a crazy bass. So if you hear some crazy bass notes, that's not me. That's my neighbor rocking out to, I don't know, Barry Manilow or Barry White or something. Either way, we're going to talk about chapter 19. And I'm introducing myself again because I'm actually recording this before I record chapter 18. But that's just me being organized. This chapter is going to be discussing immigration, specifically why immigrants are coming here, who's coming here, and how they're going to be taken advantage of. That's a very American story. We're very big on taking advantage of immigrants, and you're going to see in this chapter just exactly how we do it. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Eastern European and Asian immigrants and what they do here in the United States. So let's dive into this chapter. So, with the rise of industry, companies are going to be looking for new workers. Problems in Europe are going to help provide the workforce that the United States is going to need. However, the experience of the new arrivals is not going to be what they were expecting. Nearly 11 million immigrants entered the United States between the years 1870 and 1900, and 10 million of those immigrants come from Europe. That's a lot of people, and they're all going to be coming to, well, most of them are going to be coming to the east coast of the United States. By 1890, more immigrants came from Eastern Europe and Asia, and we call them new immigrants. The reason why we call them new immigrants is that they're not cool like the old immigrants we used to have. The immigrants that came from Western Europe. These are, lame immigrants from Eastern Europe. Like Mr. Mullen's family. Let's talk about the difference between old and new immigrants. Okay, so making a little T-chart here. Our old immigrants. These are the immigrants that came to America pretty much from the beginning up through about the early 1800s. Old immigrants are from Western Europe, which means they're more likely to be wealthy and, more importantly, literate when they come to the United States. They're also more likely to speak English, and that's going to be a big thing. They're more likely to be skilled workers. They can actually do something that involves a skill. They have some semblance of experience with democracy, which, is kind of how we run things here. And they're Protestant, which, when it comes to a religious nature of this country, whether immigrants like it or not, this is a predominantly Protestant country. Let's contrast that with new immigrants. New immigrants are going to be coming from Eastern Europe, or as I like to consider them, Eastern Europe. Most are impoverished, illiterate males. They're not bringing over entire families here. It's a lot of just men that are coming. Single men, impoverished, not a lot of skills, don't speak the language. They can only do unskilled labor. A lot of these people are farmers, but we don't really need farmers anymore. So a lot of these new immigrants are going to be unskilled laborers, factory workers, really jobs that pretty much anyone can do with very minimal training. Most of these immigrants also have no desire to assimilate. They don't want to become Americans. You might see things or hear things about the American dream. That's not really what they were here for. They were here to earn money and they were here to, not starve to death in Europe. So it's not like they're here to make America better. They're here to make their lives better. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we can't consider these immigrants with the same mentality that we can earlier immigrants. Finally, many of these immigrants are going to be Catholic or Jewish. Why is that? Well, that's a big thing in Eastern Europe anyway, but that's going to be a problem because their cultural values are going to clash with the Protestant established immigrants that have already been here for a couple of generations. There's going to be a lot of clashes. The most important thing to notice here is that these new immigrants don't really have a desire to be American, and that's going to really upset established Americans, especially as we're going through a patriotic time in American history. So, why do they leave? When we discuss history, we look at push and pull factors. So, what is going to push these immigrants out of Europe? What's so bad about Europe that they're all so desperate to leave? I can think of a couple things, maybe six. Uh, they're starving. There's a big famine going on in Europe. On top of a famine, they're also having a crop failure, which sounds like the same thing, but it's not. There's an overpopulation problem in Europe at this time period. There's religious persecution, as always, especially for the Jews, but we'll get to that when we get to the Holocaust. There's going to be outright violence towards people that are different in Europe, for example, not Protestant. And then finally, there's something that we call industrial depression. So Europe starts the Industrial Revolution, about 20 or 30 years ahead of us, and by 1870, they've kind of maxed out their efficiency. They're really not going to need any more workers than they already have. So the United States is just starting to really crank up our industrialization. We are desperate for more workers. So we have the availability of jobs. So that's what's pushing these immigrants out of Europe. What's pulling them in? Plain and simple, we have jobs and they need them. Now that was mostly our discussion of Eastern European immigrants. Let's talk about immigrants that came specifically here to the West Coast. Let's talk about Asian immigrants. Asian immigration into the United States is going to be very similar to Eastern European immigration to the United States. Most Asian immigrants are going to come to the U.S. to escape a bad life in Asia. This is not a Asian history class, but things are not so great in Asia in the late 1800s. And to be honest, they hear stories of things being great here. Perhaps you've heard of this thing called the gold rush. So the idea that there is gold just literally falling down the mountains, all you have to do is get here and you'll be rich with gold. So they're going to hear those stories in Asia and they're going to come to the Pacific coast, or I should call it the West Coast. They're going to come here. However, by the time they get here, by the mid to late 1800s, most of that gold's already gone. And there's going to be severe competition for the remaining gold. So, Chinese workers are going to come to the gold fields and they're going to be told, okay, well, thank you for coming. You can't go and mine. Instead, why don't you do something that's a little bit more appropriate for who you are? Why don't you open a restaurant or start doing laundry? Again, very racist, also very what happened. So that's going to be a problem. Chinese immigrants are not even tolerated in the state of California until the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, which we have already discussed. Whites are unwilling to do the dangerous work involved with railroad building, so Asian immigrants are going to do it instead. It also helps that Asian immigrants are going to have technical experience when it comes to dealing with fireworks and gunpowder, which we are going to use to basically blow up the Rocky Mountains. That way we can build this railroad. So again, Transcontinental Railroad does not get built without Asian immigrants. Asian immigrants on the West Coast and Irish immigrants on the East Coast are going to build that railroad. However, there's going to be almost an immediate backlash against immigration. Now, we have talked about backlash against immigration before. The very fancy word for this starts with an N, is nativism, correct? So we're going to have a huge return to nativism here in the United States. In case you've forgotten, nativism is this idea that being a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male is the best thing you can possibly be. And if you are anything else, or not one of those four things, you are seen as inferior. So we're going to have a huge backlash against Asian immigrants specifically, as well as Eastern immigrants, but especially Asian immigrants, because they're not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males, and it's pretty obvious when you see someone from Latin America or Asia that they are not Anglo-Saxon, they are not white, so they're really easy to discriminate against. So we don't like immigrants in this country as a general rule, and Asian immigrants and Latin American immigrants and even African immigrants are going to be the most obvious ones to scrutinize against because they're not white. That's actually a basis for a lot of American racism. We don't like any immigrant, but we can't really pick on the white ones because we can't tell if they're the good whites or the bad whites. So we're going to be picking on people that are obviously not white simply because they're not white, regardless of knowing anything else about them, because they must be an immigrant and they don't look like the people that were here before. Which is also kind of silly because, the Native Americans were here first. But, never let logic get in the way of a good historical discussion. So, there's going to be an increase in nativism, and a lot of nativism and a lot of this sentiment is going to be geared towards Asian immigrants. In fact, really one of the few specific laws that prohibits one ethnic group from coming to the United States is going to be what we call the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This is designed to limit immigration against one specific ethnic group in the United States. It declared a halt on all Chinese immigration for 10 years. And by the way, this says Chinese Exclusion Act. This is a fancy way of saying Asian Exclusion Act. The lawmakers that wrote this are not going to be nice enough to recognize that there is more than one Asian nationality. So using Chinese, the idea here is that it's supposed to be everyone from Asia. Also, if any Asian left the United States, they would have a difficult time coming back, even if they were a citizen. This law is going to be in effect until 1943. Now, it has little practical effect in solving the problems that immigrants were causing to this country, because even though the Chinese were restricted, other immigrant groups came to fill their void, specifically Eastern European immigrants. So, if the goal is to truly stop immigration, this does almost nothing. But if the goal is to persecute a ethnic group that is non-white, then this law does a lot. Here are some more political cartoons that kind of describe what is going on here. Kind of hard to tell. That is Uncle Sam in the middle. You have a Irish immigrant there on the left, and you have a Asian immigrant on the right. You can see they are both swallowing Uncle Sam. Then there in the bottom left, you see that Uncle Sam is almost gone. And then if you look at the very far image on the bottom right, you see that the Chinese man has uh, eaten the Irishman. So out of all the immigrants, Asian immigrants are the worst. Here's another one. Go ahead and take a second and take a look at this and see what you notice. Excellent. So you may have noticed that this Asian immigrant is bringing industry, order, peace, and sobriety to the United States, but they're not going to be allowed in simply because they are Asian, despite the fact that this is actually, all these sentiments are true about Asian immigrants. They are industrious, they're good hard workers, they are sober, which is something you can't say for us Irish, and they're also big on peace. But they're not going to be allowed in simply because they're non-white. That's kind of how racism works. So where are these immigrants going to live? Well, one of the other reasons that there's a little bit of negative mentality behind immigrants is that immigrants tend to live in subpar housing. Remember, they're coming to the United States without any money, especially these new immigrants are coming to the United States without any money, so they can't afford a good house. They're basically going to live wherever they can. And these places are not going to be very nice. It's going to be a slum, or a ghetto is the word that we would use for it. Immigrants are also going to cluster together. If you are coming from, I don't know, Czechoslovakia or some other godforsaken Eastern European country, and you're coming here to the United States, if you don't speak English, you're going to want to cluster around people that speak the language of your home country, especially if you don't have any money to go to school to learn English. So what starts to happen is that certain ethnic groups start to cluster together in cities. Perhaps you guys have heard of places like Little Italy or Little Tokyo or Chinatown. Those actually exist for a practical purpose. These immigrants are coming to the United States with no ability to speak English, so they're going to cluster together with other people that speak their language and try to live just dealing with people that speak their language. Now, that's all fine and good, but remember, there's going to be a lot of negative sentiment about these immigrants because they don't want to be American. They don't want to learn to speak English. They don't want to act like other Americans. They're going to stay the same way that they were in their home country. So there's going to be a lot of negative opinions about immigrants simply for that fact. And on top of that, the implication is, well, geez, if immigrants are comfortable living in these horrible conditions, they must be horrible people because they can tolerate this. So we won't pay them very well so they can afford a better place. And obviously they're bad people because they're living in a horrible place. Again, this type of circular logic is pivotal to understanding racism of any kind, and it is essentially how America treats its workers that are not natural-born citizens. Now let's talk about how these immigrants are going to be exploited, because that's the other benefit of the American ethic, is exploiting immigrants who will not make a lot of money. Um, Other textbooks or other review books might mention this earlier than our textbook does. Our textbook introduces this story a little late even though it happens almost immediately after the Civil War, your textbook discusses it here. So um, don't be hung up if you're reading another review book or another review material and they've already mentioned this. It's okay. It's all kind of part of the bigger story. But it's just easier for us to tell here. So that's where I will. So immigrants are going to be exploited because of a loophole in how voting works. Before a time period of voting machines and voter IDs and things such as that, it was hard to tell who was a citizen and who wasn't. So what's going to start happening is that immigrants are going to be exploited for their votes. I'll describe this process. There's actually a very good movie that shows this. I can't show it in class. It's a little graphic. But the movie Gangs of New York has a very good scene where voters that are coming straight off of a boat from Eastern Europe are going to be encouraged to vote, even though they don't even speak the language. And they're going to vote several times through this process. So what's happening here? What is this process? Well, it all starts with someone called a political boss. And a political boss is going to run something called a political machine. This whole process is designed as a corrupt method of obtaining votes. So what happens here is that a political boss is going to speak to a politician and say, okay, I'll use Eichen here. Eichen, you want to be governor of New York. Great, you need votes to become governor. I, Mr. Mullen, the political boss, am going to get you those votes. All you got to do is give me some money and future favors politically for getting those votes. Eichen says, yes, that's worth it to me. Here is some money. Go get me some votes. I, the political boss, am going to meet the immigrants when they come off of the boats, and I'm going to encourage them to vote as many times as I can get them to for you, Eichen. And that's essentially how this is going to work. On top of that, immigrants are going to like the political boss because the political boss is going to help get immigrants jobs, give them money, and really what ends up happening after a couple of years, even though Eichen is the governor and he has the quote unquote real power, really all the immigrants talk to and listen to me, not him. So even though Eichen is the governor, they really start to follow the political boss. And now this unelected person has a lot of authority and power in big cities. And these political machines became huge and they became super corrupt. That's essentially how this whole thing is going to go down. Eventually, it's going to become so corrupt that a lot of money is going to be taken from cities through all this corruption. So somehow these political machines are going to have to be brought down. And it happens in kind of a strange way. When you are asked about political machines on a test, you are always, always, always going to be asked about this man pictured here. His name is Boss William Tweed. He's going to run a political machine called Tammany Hall, which is in New York. So Boss Tweed is the example of the most powerful political boss, and he's running the most powerful political machine called Tammany Hall. At the time, Tammany Hall is going to be involved in over $70 million in corruption and stealing from the government. So obviously, Boss Tweed, who again runs a political machine called Tammany Hall, is going to be a bad, corrupt guy. So he's going to be brought down. And he's brought down by an unlikely source. He's brought down by a cartoonist named Thomas Nast. So Thomas Nast is going to draw a cartoon like the one pictured here on the right. Now, I want you guys to think about this cartoon from the perspective of an immigrant. Go ahead and pause this video for a second and see if you can get the message behind this cartoon before I tell you. Okay, great. You're back. So what's going on in this cartoon? Well, if you ask me, it looks like that there is this overweight, shady, non-trustworthy guy standing next to a ballot. Now, remember, these images are going to be shown to both people that are literate and people that are illiterate, like, recent immigrants. So if you see a picture like this, you're going to recognize the face of Boss Tweed, and you're probably going to have a negative opinion of him and think, ooh, this might not be such a good guy, simply because of how this cartoon was drawn. Now, could Thomas Nast have written some big, long, 45-page expose explaining how bad Boss William Tweed is? Sure, but who's going to read it? Not the immigrants. You have to, if you want immigrants to make a change, you have to do something visual. And that's exactly what Thomas Nast does. It exposes the corruption of Boss Tweed, and the political machine of Tammany Hall disappears. Now, not everyone is going to be out there to just exploit immigrant labor. Some people are actually going to have a genuine big heart and actually want to help these immigrants out. This is the start of what we call the reform movement. This is going to be a much bigger deal in the next chapter, which I think is chapter 20. It's going to be a much bigger deal in chapter 20, but this is going to be the beginning of that story. So let's talk about the reform movement that's going to build. There's going to be a growing reform movement that's going to take place. It's going to replace the laissez-faire attitude of the government. If I haven't talked about that word, laissez-faire means hands-off. So the U.S. government is going to be very hands-off and not deal with all these huge pressing issues. They're basically going to avoid them. So uh, average citizens are going to start making changes because the government isn't. The biggest part of this struggle is going to be seen in the upper and middle classes. The question here is, how can the wealthy justify their prosperity while everyone else around them is impoverished? Like, that doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem fair. So how do the wealthy justify their wealth and extravagance when they see all of these immigrants living in horrible conditions? The answer is the Victorian morality. The idea is that the financial success of the upper class was because of their intelligence, talent, morality, and self-control. This is going to be a phrase called social Darwinism, which again, we've already mentioned in a previous chapter. The Victorian morality believed that the human condition was malleable, which means anyone could be saved or changed. This also means that they're going to start to promote reforms to make life better for everyone. You can learn to be like me if you just have a little more education. You can learn to be not a poor, stinking Eastern European immigrant as long as you're educated in the ways that you really should be living. They're also going to support hard work, good manners, and high art. They took it as a personal crusade to help the immigrants become better people, like they were. Because the government's not going to do it, they're going to do it for themselves. There's going to be a huge dichotomy between the rich and the poor during this era, and the idea of the reform movement is to try to not necessarily close that gap, but maybe bring the poor up a little bit. If only for the fact that, they won't be so depressing to look at if they're a little bit cleaner. Wow, that sounds horrible. But hey, that's the truth for you. So, this time period is also going to have a return of the cult of domesticity. We've talked about this before. The cult of domesticity means that the role of a woman is to stay in the home. But here's a problem. What happens if your role as a woman is to stay in the home, but you make enough money to not have to work, and in fact, you make enough money that, or your husband, I should say, makes enough money that he can afford a maid and a butler and someone to watch the kids? What is a woman to do with her free time, a wealthy woman that is, to do with her free time if she's not allowed to leave the home and work? What can a woman do? Well, women, maybe they should go and help out the poor around them. We'll talk about how they do it in just a second, but there's one other thing that's going on in the background of this reform movement. It has to do with religion. So there's going to be a reform movement, and it's going to be that, the Victorian morality and the cult of domesticity are going to be pushing it. It's also going to be pushed from a religious perspective. You know, if you actually read holy books, almost all of them say, yo, bros, take care of the poor. It's a really good thing. In fact, it's a very holy thing to take care of the poor. This dude named Walter is going to say, hey, you know what? It is our duty as religious people to take care of the poor. So let's do this. Let's actually do our duty and take it as our, in this case, Christian duty to take care of the poor and the impoverished and to make their lives better. So we have two movements here happening at the same time. We have this Victorian morality which says we have to find a way to make poor people not so depressing and make them live a little bit better life. And then we also have this religion movement saying, hey, you know what? It is the job of religious people to take care of the poor. So let's do it. How does this get done? It gets done through something called settlement houses. Settlement houses are going to be homes that invite immigrants and poor people to live among college-educated, wealthy people. That way the poor can learn how to live like a wealthy, clean person. Immigrants were taught language, hygiene, cooking skills to basically help them live a better life here in the United States. Crazy thing is, as weird as it sounds, it worked. And within a few years, settlement houses are going to basically spring up all over the country. The most famous settlement house is going to be the Hull House, founded in 1889 by a woman named Jane Addams. And, that's the story there. Sweet. Let's move on. Okay, this last slide. If you had to ask me, I'd say that you're probably not going to see a direct test question on this idea, but it's a big idea of what is happening during this time period. It's this basically the birth of American culture starts to happen towards the end of the 1800s, and it's important. It's an important story to make sure that we understand that we hear, because it actually is kind of the things that you all know and love today are going to come from this cultural awakening that happens after the Civil War. More than ever, maybe because of all this factory work, but a lot of factories are only going to be open 6 days a week. So, what do Americans do with their free time if they don't need to farm all day? What are they going to do? They got to have some sort of entertainment to, you know, alleviate the boredom. The lower classes needed entertainment more than any other group, which led to a rise of public activities like boxing matches and sporting events. Of particular interest is going to be this new sport called baseball. It's a game that's played during the day, and it's played nearly every day in front of very large crowds. Ticket prices are going to be inexpensive, and the sport is going to bring people together based off of geographic region, not just nationality. If you live here in Southern California, you're going to be an Angels fan, or a Dodgers fan, or Padres fan. But you're going to be a fan of one of those teams based off of the region you live in. So suddenly, it doesn't matter to me if you are from Italy, if you are from Czechoslovakia, if you are from Mongolia. If you're wearing an Angels hat, you and I are best friends. And if you're wearing a Dodgers hat, we are bitter rivals. So what baseball actually does, and there are actually a lot of studies on this, it's going to actually help tear down some sort of this nativist barrier that we have. It's going to break down some racial and ethnic barriers we have in this country through a popular sport. So baseball is going to save America and make America a better place, just like I've always been saying. There's also going to be a rise of this entertainment thing called vaudeville. Vaudeville is basically plays, and it's essentially like a sketch comedy show today, mixed with like tumbling, juggling, and other acrobatic feats. So think of like an episode of Key and Peele mixed with I don't know, an episode of I don't know, people getting hurt or something like that on TV. Um, those shows are always popular. They were popular when I was your age, and they were popular in the 1800s. People like watching other people get hurt. That's part of the beauty of it. That's kind of be what vaudeville is. It's a form of entertainment, and it's going to be enjoyed by all social classes. Nothing better than watching somebody get hurt. Doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, watching somebody get hurt is pretty funny. You know it's true. Literature. We're also going to have a bit of a literary growth during this time period. Um, we're going to get out of this romanticism phase. Bleh. And now we're going to be talking about a new form of literature called realism. These are stories that are less crazy and more like, real. Authors such as Mark Twain, one of my personal favorite authors, and a dude named Bret Hart, not the professional wrestler, are going to talk about life in the Midwest and the Far West, and both brought the ideas of fiction to the forefront of American literature. Finally, and I'm going to show you an example of this in class because it's one of my favorite musical stylings, there's going to be a new type of music during this time period called ragtime. It's going to be a little bit more upbeat and jaunty and happy versus other types of music. A lot of classical music is very serious and very emotionally deep. You can't really dance to a lot of classical music unless you're going to do a waltz. Ragtime is going to be a more upbeat, more frantic, more energetic type of music that's going to catch on during this time period, and it kind of parallels the emotional attitudes of the people in America of this time period. We're happy, we're upbeat, we're working hard, we're making money. We want to celebrate in our downtime, I guess, as it were. And it's actually going to become the basis of jazz, which is the basis of rock and roll, which is the basis of pop, which is the basis, of course, of the boy bands that you all know and love. But again, that's what makes you beautiful. Hope you guys had a good chapter. Good luck on your test.